today I'm going to be talking to you about glucose's little brother, fructose. So fructose is similar to glucose in that it is a single sugar molecule, which we call a monosaccharide. Mono meaning one, and saccharide meaning basically a sugar. So sucrose, which is your table sugar, is actually made up of one fructose and one glucose molecule. So sucrose, which is your sugar, is made up of one glucose and one fructose. So it's a 50-50 split. So if we think about sweetness, so sucrose is sort of mildly sweet, and some of you may think it's quite sweet, but really sucrose, if we're looking on the sweetness score, sucrose is mildly sweet. Glucose is also mildly sweet. And fructose is very sweet. So when you consume these different sugars, generally you're not consuming the glucose or the fructose by itself. You're usually eating food that will contain a combination of these. But the fructose is actually what makes things taste very sweet. But the glucose and the fructose behave very differently in your body, and that's basically what we're going to be covering and talking about today. So glucose is essential for life. It's so essential that if you don't consume glucose, your body will actually make it. So that's how important it is. Your cells, there are a number of cells that really need glucose to survive. And when you consume glucose or foods that contain glucose, what happens is about, let's say, 75 to 80%, 75 to 80% of the glucose will go to your muscles, and in your muscles it is stored as glycogen, which is basically a sugar molecule in storage form, and it will increase energy. So really the glucose, what we need it to do is to be converted into energy, which is ATP, so the cells can use it. So after a meal, 75 to 80% of the glucose will go to your muscles, and it will increase the energy, available energy for your cells, and whatever is sort of left over, it will be stored as glycogen. So there's basically some spare glucose there for when your muscles need it. And once the muscles are full, then about, let's say, 10 to 15% goes to the liver, normally. And in the liver, you will get a rise in ATP, again, so there's available energy for the liver to use. You will also get some of that glucose stored as glycogen as well. Some of it will be converted into fat and it will be stored in the liver. So when you have excess glucose, once your liver glycogen stores are full and it's used whatever energy it needs, then the leftover will be turned into fat. So it will increase the amount of fat in the liver, and then some of it will be turned into triglycerides, which is another type of fat. And the triglycerides then are shuttled around the body to other cells, and it can be stored as fat, either on the belly or in other places. So that is basically what happens to glucose. And then of course a little bit of the glucose after a meal will go to either the brain or to other cells to be used for energy. So glucose, when you eat it, you have available energy to your body, and then the body will also store some of that. Whereas fructose, none of the cells in your body can use fructose for energy. So fructose almost exclusively goes to the liver, straight to the liver, and maybe about 10% in the gut, about 10% is converted into glucose, and then the glucose can then be absorbed. But a majority of the fructose goes to the liver, and interestingly, there's actually a reduction in energy. So when you consume fructose and the fructose goes to the liver, most of the fructose, a little bit might be converted into glucose, but generally when you're eating foods that contain fructose, they also contain glucose. So glucose is already filling up the liver, and there's already energy available to the liver because of the glucose. So most of this fructose is then basically maybe converted to glycogen, but again, that's probably been done with the glucose that you've ingested, and then it's turned into fat. So either fat that is left in the liver, or it's turned into these triglycerides that then are shuttled around the body. And this turning fructose into fat, or even into glycogen, or even into glucose, this is a very energy intensive process. So it actually requires energy. Rather than giving out energy, it uses energy. So there's actually a reduction in ATP because it's using up some of the energy. Now, glucose metabolism is tightly regulated in the body. So the body has these checks and balances, and it senses when glucose is high or low, and it has these processes in place, and insulin is a big part of that, to kind of adjust where glucose is and what's going on, and telling the body, telling the brain to stop eating, that sort of thing. So glucose is really tightly regulated, whereas fructose metabolism is largely unregulated. So it almost slips under the radar, and that is quite important, which we'll kind of go into. Fructose, the other thing that fructose does is it stimulates the reward and pleasure centers in the brain. And this is to a much greater extent, not much greater, but it does have a greater, it activates those areas in the brain to a greater extent than glucose does. So this is stimulating reward and pleasure. And if you've heard of the dopamine reward pathway, this is what it's doing. So it's lighting up the dopamine reward pathway. So it's telling your brain, this is good, this is great, remember this, eat more of it, and do it again. So it's encouraging you to seek out this food again. And interestingly, in studies, people who are given fructose are more likely to, or more willing to, give up monetary rewards. So they're willing to give up money for that food. So basically the brain is thinking, oh, I don't care about any other rewards. I need to eat this food now. Which is different to glucose, which basically does the opposite. And it tells the brain that you've eaten, and it stimulates appetite hormones to say that you've got food and you're okay. although glucose does still stimulate the reward centers, so it does remind you that that food was good and to still eat more of it. But fructose has a much more potent effect. And that is probably partly due to the sweetness factor. Because fructose is so sweet, those taste receptors will immediately send that message to the brain. It's got a stronger message that's sent to the brain to say, this is really good, eat more of it, and it encourages you to seek it out again. So when you eat fructose, the brain gets this message that there's incoming energy, I'm sensing this sweetness, so we've got energy coming in, but then there's no corresponding rise in blood glucose, or at least there's only a mild increase in blood glucose, and then there's a reduction in this energy. So the body actually gets tricked into thinking that it's starving or that's going into this hibernation mode. So it's thinking, oh, I thought there was meant to be some energy coming in, but the blood sugars haven't gone up and we don't have this extra available energy. We better go into starvation and hibernation mode. So if you think of fructose like a storage molecule, and it really triggers this hibernation starvation mode. And by doing that, it encourages fat production. So you get greater fat production and greater liver fat, and it also suppresses the body from burning fat because it wants to hold on to whatever energy it can. If you're going into a period of no food, then it needs to hold on to whatever energy it can. And it also causes insulin resistance. So by causing insulin resistance, it's trying to preserve whatever glucose or energy you have in the body. So it makes the cells more insulin resistant. So the glucose is shuttled back to the liver and converted into fat for storage. So it promotes insulin resistance, which then further drives this fat production. Which then, the fat production in itself, when you get fat building up in your cells, that can also drive the insulin resistance. So we get this kind of cycle happening, this negative metabolic cycle. And the fructose will promote what we call hedonic eating, like I was saying before, because it lights up the dopamine reward pathway. It promotes you to just keep on eating for pleasure. Fructose, unlike glucose, also does not suppress the hunger hormone called ghrelin. So ghrelin is a hunger hormone. Normally, it will increase when you're hungry, and it will tell the brain you're hungry, so you need to eat. And when you eat food normally, glucose and other molecules will suppress ghrelin. So when you've eaten, it suppresses, so glucose and insulin would normally suppress ghrelin to say, we've eaten, so we don't need to eat anymore, so let's get ghrelin down to stop that signal to the brain. Whereas fructose does not suppress ghrelin. So ghrelin levels can still be high, and that means that the message to your brain is still eat. You need to eat because you're hungry. And then the other thing that can happen that promotes this whole hibernation, starvation mode is that fructose can induce leptin resistance. So leptin is kind of the opposite to ghrelin. Leptin is a hormone that is released from the fat cells, and leptin is elevated. So after you've eaten, over the course of the day, leptin will slowly rise, and that is because your fat cells have been storing some of this fat, and as they start to reach capacity, leptin is signaling to the brain that good, we're all full and we're good, so you don't really need to eat anymore, and the need to eat is less because we've got a good backup here. But when there's insulin resistance, the brain doesn't get that message from leptin. So the brain thinks that the fat stores are not full yet and that you need to keep eating to fill up those fat stores. So you can see this whole sequelae of things that happen that fructose is doing, which encourages you to just keep on eating and to keep on putting on fat, and it becomes largely dysregulated, like I said. So it can cause obesity and fatty liver and all of these complications and insulin resistance. Now, the food manufacturers, they are well aware of this. So they know that fructose, when it's at these high concentrations, will lead to this hibernation starvation mode and will be signaling all these things to make you want more of it and to make you just want to eat, eat, eat. So they came up with a product called high fructose corn syrup, which is basically a really potent form of fructose. So high fructose corn syrup is anywhere between 60 to 90% fructose. So it's this really potent form, and it's hidden in a lot of foods, mostly your processed foods, your chips, chocolate, ice cream, soft drinks, soda is a really big one, the drinks, even sports drinks. But it can even be in things that you would least suspect, like health bars and pretzels, like savoury type snacks, and in your sports drinks and things. So it's hidden in these foods because the food manufacturers know that this is going to make you go into that hibernation starvation mode, and it's going to make you want more of it, and it's going to hit the dopamine reward pathway and make you come back for more. So we know that high consumption of fructose, in particular this high fructose corn syrup, can lead to fatty liver disease, to insulin resistance, to high blood pressure, and this is all even in the absence of weight gain. So even if you don't actually gain any weight, you're still getting all these really negative metabolic complications from having too much fructose. And in human studies, same thing is, we've found the same thing, that it can lead to overeating, it can lead to a reduction in the burning of fat, it leads to fatty buildup in the liver, fatty liver, and so forth. So we call fructose a lipogenic sugar. So lipo is fat, so lipids are fat, and genic basically means to make or create. So it's a fat producing sugar, because when you eat it, it is basically promoting the formation of fat. And you see a corresponding rise in triglyceride levels, which is done with a blood test. You also often see a reduction in HDL, which is considered the good cholesterol, and just an overall increase in sort of LDL, total cholesterol. So fructose, not so great. Another thing that happens is a byproduct of fructose metabolism is uric acid. So I don't know if you've heard of uric acid before. If you have gout, I'm sure you have. So uric acid is a byproduct of fructose. So when fructose is metabolized into these other various forms, uric acid is a product, a result of this reaction. And uric acid, we know, can increase the risk of gout. It can increase blood pressure. So if you have high blood pressure, always make sure you check your uric acid levels, and if it's high, you want to do whatever you can to get uric acid down. And fructose is not the only contributor to high uric acid, but it is definitely a main contributor. So high uric acid levels actually increase your risk of type 2 diabetes by 70 to 90%. So there's a very strong correlation with high uric acid levels and type 2 diabetes. And high uric acid levels can create an inflammatory state. So high uric acid levels are inflammatory, and uric acid can crystallize like it does in gout in the joints. It can also crystallize in the plaques in your arteries, and that contributes to the pathogenesis of cardiovascular disease. So high uric acid levels is also detrimental for heart disease, and we know that people with diabetes are double the risk of heart disease. So uric acid is also another negative consequence of too much fructose. And what is striking about fructose is that all these negative metabolic effects can happen regardless or independent of calories being consumed. So you can still see these negative metabolic effects in people who are calorie restricting. So if they're on a diet and they're not overdoing calories, you can still see these negative effects when people have too much fructose coming in. So it is very unique in that sense. Another thing that fructose can do is when it's overconsumed, it can actually cause disruption to your gut microbiome. So these are the friendly microbes, or the community of microbes that live in your gut. So fructose can cause what we call leaky gut. So it can impair the barrier that lines your gut. So you have a protective barrier on the lining of your gut to prevent things getting across into your blood that shouldn't. So it's normally tightly regulated, but when there's high fructose consumption, it disrupts the gut microbiome, and it can cause leaky gut, so that you get what we call endotoxins. So you get endotoxins getting across into the blood, and this can cause inflammation again, in like whole body inflammation. And this has both of these, the endotoxinemia, so endotoxins in the blood, and chronic inflammation have been strongly linked to fatty liver. So there's a lot of research going on at the moment with this leaky gut and inflammation and fatty liver, and part of the cause of this can be high fructose consumption. So I guess you're probably wondering, what about fruit? Because fruit is another source of fructose, but it's a natural form of sugar. Now the difference with fruit is that when you're just consuming, a small piece of fruit, the amount of fructose in that little piece of fruit is a lot less than, the really potent form of high fructose corn syrup. And the fruit also comes with lots of other constituents that can help to combat these negative effects of fructose. So it contains antioxidants, vitamin C, flavonoids, you have phytonutrients, and these can all help to mitigate the negative effects of fructose. The other thing is, because the fibre in it, particularly the soluble fibre, this can slow down digestion, so it takes longer, it spends more time in the gut, and because some of the fructose is metabolized in the gut, if there's a small amount of fructose in the fruit and it sits in the gut for a longer period of time, the amount of fructose that is metabolized in the gut is a lot greater, so that it might actually be, it might actually be 90% of the fructose metabolized in the gut, and only 10% goes to the liver, so that you don't get these negative metabolic effects. Some of it's converted to glucose. Well, most of it is then metabolized into glucose. And then the glucose is able to stimulate, appetite regulating hormones, and the body can sense that there's energy, and it doesn't trick the body into this starvation hibernation mode. So fruit, if you're consuming smaller amounts, is not bad. I would still recommend limiting your fruit intake to 2 serves a day, so no more than 2 serves a day. And really, if you have diabetes and fatty liver, you're overweight, any of these things, I would also recommend avoiding, or at least only having them on special occasions, your dried fruit, your fruit juice, and your honey, because they are all high in fructose. They're quite potent forms of fructose. Not quite the same as high fructose corn syrup, but they are high in fructose. Another little, hack, if you are having fruit, is to have it immediately after a meal, straight after a meal, because that means that your digestion is going to be slowed down, and the fructose in the fruit is going to have more time in the gut, and so it's more likely to get converted into glucose and less likely to make it to the liver and get converted into fat and to stimulate this starvation hibernation mode. Now, high fructose corn syrup has been formulated in such a way that it saturates the gut, and most of it will go straight to the liver to produce this effect, and that's exactly what the food manufacturers want. They want that to happen so that you are wanting to eat more and coming back and just not being able to stop eating their food. And that effect on the brain is also reinforcing you to keep wanting it and thinking about it. All right, so that is pretty much all I wanted to say today on fructose. So really, avoiding processed foods, because that is where you're going to get the potent form of high fructose corn syrup, which is what we really want to avoid, particularly your sodas, soft drinks, and things like that. A little bit of fruit is okay. I wouldn't be concerned about a couple of servings of fruit a day. That's really not going to cause any problems. But there is, a few little hacks there, having it after a meal, and avoiding the, dried fruit and fruit juices, because that's going to saturate the gut, and more of it is going to end up in the liver. So I hope you found this interesting and helpful. If you have, please make sure you like the video below. Please share it with friends and family if you think that they would also find it interesting or helpful or useful. Make sure you subscribe to my channel so you don't miss out on upcoming videos. And I also have an online program for people who are really serious about beating diabetes. So people who are looking for answers and are not getting them from mainstream medicine, and they are overwhelmed by the information out there on the internet. They want to work with a professional, an expert. So my program is there if that is you, if you're really ready and willing to invest and to commit, then it might be an option for you. If you think that is the case, then please make sure you book in a telephone consultation with myself or one of my team members. So you can do that. There's a link below. So that if you're really, ready and willing to commit and you're looking for answers, then it might be go for you. Okay, thank you.